utilities to order. March 8th, Wednesday. What we're going to do is we're going to have a little briefing from the KCC talking about the utility rate increases. Justin Grady, go ahead. I'll let you give us a presentation. And I think what we'll do is hold questions to the end, let Justin get through this, kind of explain what's going on with rates and there's a second presentation tomorrow. So go ahead.
Great. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, Chair Olson, members of the committee. My name is Justin Grady. I'm Chief of Revenue Requirements, Cost of Service, and Finance at the KCC. I work in the Utilities Division. Chair, would you prefer, what are we aiming for, 15 or 20 minutes of questions at the end or more? I'm pretty flexible.
15 or 20 is fine.
Okay.
And then we'll also have the next day if someone wants to ask a question.
Make sure you save all the tough questions for tomorrow afternoon when my boss is up here instead. No, I'm just kidding. I'll be back too.
We got Peter too. We can pick on a little bit.
Well, that's an everyday occurrence. So, yeah, well, good afternoon again. Appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee this afternoon. We usually try to get over at least once and talk about an update of regionally competitive rates. Obviously, the committee's calendar was quite full before turnaround, but do appreciate the chair making time for us after turnaround and working with our schedule. I'm on slide 2 now, and well, first of all, just in terms of an overview, we'll talk about rates and regional competitiveness of rates, and then we'll dive more specifically into what a rate case actually entails, and we'll talk in as much detail and specificity as the committee desires about how we actually set rates at the KCC. But for now, I'm on slide 2 with regard to regional rate comparisons. And what's on slide 2 is basically a cut and paste from the agreement that was entered into maybe going into 3 to 4 years ago now at this point, in terms of what we would present to the committee and to the House Energy every year in terms of an update for regionally competitive rates. And this agreement was developed in response to a proposed bill at the time that would have changed the law to require us to come provide this presentation. And our response to that was, you don't have to change the law to ask us to do presentations. We'll gladly come talk to you whenever you want. And so Chairman Thompson at the time put together a stakeholder group. Everybody was at the table: industrial customers, CURB, commercial or cooperatives and municipals and investor-owned utilities. And this is word for word the agreement that we reached. And so our hope at the time was that we would have a standardized level set agreement in terms of when we talk about regional rate competitiveness, this is where the data is going to come from. Unfortunately, that hasn't always been successful. There still are different lists and different calculations, but one thing that we always say is we've always stayed true to this original agreement. When we present information to the committee, it comes from the EIA. You can validate where these numbers come from. You can go pull them up on the EIA's website, and we invite anyone in the audience or the committee itself to do that, and we'd gladly sit down and show people where this data comes from. The one quick note about this EIA information, I had a conversation with someone last week that thought that this was sort of not the whole picture, that this was just the base rates and then that there's still surcharges on top of that. And no, the information that is reported to the EIA and that we pull down is literally all of the revenue, either at a state level or at an individual utility level. It's literally all of the revenue that the utility receives for electric service divided by all of the kilowatt hours. So there isn't anything else other than this, right? There's transmission delivery charges or fuel costs or property tax surcharge. It's all in here. It's all included. So slide 3. So This, I mean, we talked about the EIA. The good thing about it is it's publicly available information. Comes from an independent, apolitical source whose job, the people that work there, their job is just to report the facts. But the downside to it is that the data is quite lagged by the time we get it. So we get final year-end data in October of the year after the year has ended. And so, the most recent information in this presentation is based on year-end 2021. And the reason for that is because literally everything that the EIA has produced since that date is preliminary and not final and subject to significant revision. So, this is about the time of the year where you'll start to see new lists, and you'll start to see people talk about where Kansas ranks relative to other states around us. And that's because the EIA produces monthly data, and they do that on about a 60-day lag. So you can get data today through December of 2022. It was produced about February 25th or 27th, but it's preliminary data. And there's asterisks all over the data itself. And if you contact the EIA, they will shy you away from using preliminary data. We follow this really, really closely, and I've seen pretty significant revisions in that preliminary data. So, we kind of do everything we can not to rely on that, but it's available, it's on the internet, and so you'll start to see those lists here pretty soon, I'm sure, and so just keep that in mind. One interesting thing that so far in that 2022 preliminary data that is a dramatic change from the last several years is that Texas's residential electricity rate at this point, as of that year-to-date 2022, is actually higher than Kansas's all-in residential rate, which is a dramatic departure from just a few years ago. And of course, that's driven by volatility in natural gas prices that we've all seen and experienced over the last couple of years. But back to the data. So on slide 3, first thing to think about also with regard to EIA, the way this is calculated, so this all-in rate that you see people refer to quite frequently, it is not the rate that any customer pays for electricity in the state of Kansas. It is literally the total revenue received by all ownership classes of utility, investor-owned, municipal, cooperative, divided by all kilowatt hours of usage in a particular year. And so again, it's all in, but it's interesting, and it provides sort of a directional view over time. But it's really important to remember that there's a couple of things that really heavily influence the outcome here. One is usage, and we'll talk more about that. But because the denominator in this calculation is all kilowatt hours usage, it's relatively simple math. If there's higher usage in the denominator, your rate's going to be lower, and if there's lower usage in the denominator, your rate's going to be higher. That's an irrefutable, an immutable fact of the way the math works. And then the other thing you'll see is that, again, because this is like the weighted average of all averages, and given the fact that industrial rates are so much cheaper than the average rate, the relative proportion of industrial sales that you have in your state really makes a difference and drives this number down. So anyway, just keep those two things in mind when you see this list. But at the end of the day, you can see that over the last 6 years, with the flaws that this metric comes right out of the EIA, Kansas's all-in electric rate has actually declined over the last 6 years, 0.19%. And you can see how that compares to the regional peer average down there below. And that's, and also for 2021 over 2020, all in, Kansas's electric rate grew by a smaller amount than any other of the 9 states, regional states around us. There has been testimony, I believe, before this committee and others that when KCC or when staff presents this information that we're somehow misleading you because I'm presenting the information, but we're just presenting the data as it shows up on the EIA. We can talk about what factors would have contributed to that change over time. That's the data. On slide 4, now we're looking at industrial rates. You can see where Kansas's rates stack up to our regional peers. We are higher than some other states and lower than some other states. Again, this is not any individual utility. It's important to remember. So all cooperatives, all industrials, or all investor-owned utilities, municipals, cooperatives, all feed into this number. But similar to the observation from the 2 previous slides, in 2021, that Kansas's average industrial rate increased at the smallest amount relative to any of the other states. About 12% as much as the average, for instance. Okay, slide 5, now we're on residential rates. So again, no individual utility here, it's just across the average for the state. You can see where Kansas's residential rates compare to the states around us. And you can see that relative to 2020, from 2021 over 2020, that too is the lowest rate of growth or increase in the 10-state region. About 25% that of the average outside of Kansas. All right, slide 6. So if you've ever heard us do this presentation before, you know that we feel strongly about the fact that average monthly bills, is a very important part of this conversation when it comes to rates and regional affordability. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? The first reason is we talk to customers every day. They call in to the PACP. I talk to some of them personally. And I very, very rarely have a conversation where somebody says, my kilowatt hour rate last month went up by 6%. I'm an Evergy customer. My sister and my mother are. Nobody ever wants to have a conversation about the kilowatt hour rate. It's mostly about the very bottom line, which is how much is the bill and how much did the bill change last month. And so that doesn't mean that rates aren't important at all. It's just an important part of the conversation is monthly bills, because that's what customers are actually experiencing. And so this data is ranked by average monthly bill, same states. All this information still comes from EIA. And you can see that if you compare Kansas's average monthly bill to the regional peer average, which is calculated without Kansas, there's less than 1% difference between the average monthly bill and the regional peer average. But that's despite the fact that the average residential rate is 8% more than the non-Kansas regional average rate, right? If you look at 12.98 cents compared to 12.02 cents. But it also happens to be that our usage is approximately 8% less than the regional peer average. And that is not a coincidence, right? It literally is 8% less denominator in the calculation. And so it's very much a part of the story. If you look at that, you can notice an inverse correlation there between so-called high rate states and so-called low rate states. But if you flip to slide 7 for a second, on slide 7, this is the same data as the previous slide. Again, this all comes from EIA, right? I'm not massaging this data at all. I'm just sorting it. You look at the middle column, now that we've sorted it by rates. Kansas has the 3rd highest rates in the region, lower than Colorado and Minnesota, higher than Iowa, South Dakota, Texas, et cetera. And so if you look how stark the inverse correlation is between price and usage, right? So look how clearly inversely correlated those 2 columns are. And so in other words, most of the conversation in this building on social media posts and otherwise is rates, rates, rates. But if you look at a so-called low rate state like Oklahoma or North Dakota, you see, or Arkansas, you see that they actually pay more for electricity service on average than an average residential customer does at the end of the day. And that's just, it's not a coincidence. It's the math. It's the way the math works. It's the way the rate setting process works. So, you can have a quote unquote high rate state like Minnesota or Colorado, and yet they pay less. Their customers on average pay less for electricity service than a Kansas customer does. And so it's just, you've got to take into account, we always have monthly bills is a big part of the equation. And then last slide on slide 8 is simply the same data from the table from before, but this just graphs it, right? So on the left axis, we have average usage. You can see the states below. On the right axis, we have electric rates. And it just, I think, is clearly, when I put this slide together, this is the first time I've had this in a presentation. This just as clearly as I can indicate or try to present that there is a direct correlation between the higher your usage is on average, the lower your rates are, and vice versa. So given all of that, rates just can't be the only part of the conversation when we're talking about residential customers. All right, slide 9. So slide 9 is the first time that we're actually talking about any individual utility in the state. Everything we looked at before was statewide, cooperatives, municipals, investor-owns, right? But now we're actually talking about Evergy. And we do this, well, one, we agreed to do this in the rate comparison data that we agreed to provide, but this is important because usually people start off with the conversation of, Kansas's rate is higher than every other state around us. And then that must translate into the fact that the KCC is not doing its job and not regulating Evergy appropriately. And so this is the data. The EIA also collects and tracks individual utility data. So if you look at if you're an Evergy customer, you have Evergy customers that are your constituents. The two columns here that are the most pertinent are the very far left column, Evergy Kansas Metro, and the very far right column, Evergy Kansas Central. Again, I'll note this is all in, so all surcharges, fuel costs, et cetera, are accounted in this. And if you look at, for instance, well, just quickly, the reason that Evergy Kansas North and South are presented separately is because they are still technically separate utilities. So these companies merged back in, was it 1991? And I think so. But they are still separate entities that report to the federal government separately, but we've consolidated their rates a long time ago. That's why Evergy Kansas Central is the operative number there. But anyway, you can see how bills have changed over the last 10 years. We've calculated the compound annual growth rate of those bills and the aggregate, just the growth itself. So, so on average, Evergy Kansas Central's bills, residential monthly bills, have grown by 1.19% over the last 10 years. And, relative to inflation, if you were to look that number up today through CPI through December 2021, that's 1.87% on average. Slide 10 is just the same data, but it's graphed. So there I didn't graph all 4 of the columns because they intersect and you can't read any of the labels, but that's the data. And then slide 11, we added after we presented to the House because somebody came up to me afterwards and said, I really appreciated seeing that Evergy average monthly bill data, but what about rates? Why don't you have their actual rates graphed over a 10-year period of time? And so that's what this is. This is Evergy Kansas Central, industrial, residential, and commercial rates, largest rate regulated utility in the state. And you can see how the rates have changed. Again, this is all in, including all delivery charges and surcharges and everything else, and how they've changed over the time frame, and how that compares to inflation. One quick observation is, for instance, residential rates over the last 10 years have grown in total, without accounting for inflation or anything else, 16.98%. But bills have only increased by 12.54%. And that's because rates are not the only picture when it comes to what customers are actually paying. Usage matters too. And so, inflation in that period of time from 2012 to 2021 has been 21%. And because again, these are aggregate numbers over a 10-year period of time, right? Slide 12. So there is attached to this testimony, I have a list, and it's a piece of paper that looks like this. It's a 8.5 by 11 white piece of paper with each utility that operates in the 9 states surrounding Kansas. And that is for industrial, commercial, and residential, what their actual rates are. And on slide 12, I have where Evergy stands compared to those other utilities in terms of residential rates, commercial and industrial. Evergy's rates, out of those 38 utilities, they rank 17th highest for residential customers' bills or rates. That's 0.69% higher than the average. Their bills are 1.64% lower than the average utility. You can see where the Evergy Kansas Metro ranks in terms of bills and rates, and commercial and industrial. Evergy Kansas Central has lower. So if you're an Evergy customer in Wichita or Topeka, their commercial rates are lower than 3.75% lower than the average outside of Kansas. Their industrial rates are almost 4% lower than the average outside of Kansas. The industrial rates for Evergy Kansas Metro, are quite a bit higher. And that's been an issue for 20 years, really, in that the reason for that is because Evergy Kansas Metro just does not have, it's mostly their customer density and their customer representation. They just don't have a lot of industrial sales on the Kansas side of the line. And so, when their costs are allocated to that class, there's just not a lot of billing determinants to make up to spread those fixed costs out over. And so that's just has been an issue for as long as I've been doing this, and it will continue to be an issue. Sure, it'll be a lively discussion in this upcoming rate case as well. Okay, slide 13 and 14, I'm not really going to touch on much. I mean, the data is pretty self-explanatory. It was what we agreed to report for cooperatives and municipals, and you can see where Kansas stands in terms of relative to our other states and relative to the national average for cooperatives and municipals. The one thing I want to note about that is that not every cooperative or every municipal utility in the state of Kansas reports into EIA. So it's an incomplete data set, probably because they're self-regulated. They don't have to listen to the federal government or report into the government. And so I can only assume that the other states around Kansas are that way as well. But we're just reporting the data as it came in. So that's part one of the presentation. I can do the next half in about 15 minutes, or we can stop right now and take questions. Up to the chair.
Questions? Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation today. It's a good stopping point because I had a question about page 12, and we kind of stopped just after that. The Evergy Kansas Metro rate and the Evergy Kansas Central rate are quite different in how they rank compared to others. And you did offer an explanation, so you kind of answered my question before I asked it, which I appreciate. My district would be in the Evergy Kansas Metro area, correct? In the Kansas City area, Johnson County. And if my constituents ask, well, why is it so much higher? Because we're in the metro area as opposed to where Evergy Kansas Central would be. Is it because we don't have as much industrial use there, or how can I explain that to those folks?
A really great question, and I'm glad I got an opportunity to address it. So, Evergy Kansas Metro is the old Kansas City Power and Light system, right? They are still today a totally separate utility. They have separate rates, separate service territory, separate tariffs. They own different assets than Evergy Kansas Central. Evergy Kansas Central is the old Westar service territory. They're still a separate utility with a separate tariff book. And I know customers, it's difficult for customers to grasp that concept because customers think, no, it's Evergy, right? We had a merger. Well, we had a common holding company ownership structure by both separate utilities. So, it's associated with the difference in their customer. They do have less industrial customers. They own different assets. So during Winter Storm Uri, the Evergy Kansas Metro customers, your constituents are about to start to receive a monthly benefit of like $6 a month for a year associated with Winter Storm Uri. That's the only utility in the entire 14-state region that actually benefited from Winter Storm Uri. And it's because of the construction of, they have more baseload coal-fired and nuclear-fired generation relative to their load and relative to their wind portfolio. They have almost no natural gas exposure. So they just had power plants that were running, that were able to sell power into the market at those times. And in Kansas, we capture all that benefit for customers, right? So I know that's just one example, but and whereas on Evergy Kansas Central side, they incurred $2.85 of cost per residential customer for 2 years. It's still one of the best impacts in the whole region, but that comparison is, I mean, hopefully that helps. It's just a different system. They're different,
Thank you, appreciate that.
Senator
That helps.
Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Justin. On slide 7, I find this is pretty interesting to me, the inverse relationship between consumption and your average price per kilowatt hour. Almost looks like we need to be using more electricity because you look at the states who are having higher consumption have generally the lower rates. So what's happening in those other states? Is there less base load, so they're utilizing their plants more efficiently, a higher capacity factor than Kansas? Because our load has been flat essentially for a long period of time. I'm just trying to get my head around this.
Yeah, great questions. I mean, so there's two things going on, right? I mean, at a high level, it's true that relative to an existing installed base of generation, the more you use and the more efficiently you use those assets, the lower your rates are going to be. That's why industrial sales are so critical, right? And that's why industrial sales contribute so significantly to where you stand because of their high load factor usage, because they're using the same amount of power 24 hours a day, generally. But on the other hand, load growth in Kansas is in the last year or so starting to really pick up. And we're getting to the point where, we had this conversation 2 or 3 years ago. It was all about, we've got too much base load. We're not using enough of it. We need to consider securitizing and closing down those coal plants. The conversation has changed dramatically, and my prediction is that it won't be long. We'll be talking about maybe additional capacity, or bringing in some additional capacity, or selling less of our capacity. So there's no easy answers here, because the thing is, if we just put out public service announcements to say use as much electricity as you can, the short run impact of that's likely going to be lower rates, but the longer run impact of that is we're going to have to build another power plant, right? And maybe transmission lines and distribution lines. So I would say that the other thing is that outside of fuel cost and a small portion of O&M expenses, most of the cost of producing electricity is fixed. And so, again, relative to whatever your installed base of baseload capacity is, It's just the way the math works in the rate setting process. And more importantly, it's the way EIA calculates the data. The higher usage you have in the denominator, the lower your rate's going to be. So, we've looked at some of these states. I mean, obviously, some of them, like Oklahoma and Arkansas, you go, well, that's just summer heating load, right? And Minnesota and Colorado, they don't run their air conditioners in the summer. And so some of this makes sense. But then you look at North Dakota and you go, well, why is North Dakota and South Dakota so different? Well, we looked it up, and North Dakota has a incredible amount of installed electric heating capacity. Their residential customers use electricity for heating a lot compared to, say, South Dakota or Minnesota. So those things really do matter, I mean, it's just, there's a lot, right? Nothing's ever simple in this business, as you know, but it's,
Well, and there's always extra capacity, and then when you're running tight, you can't just build another 50 megawatts or whatever, you got to expand. Go ahead and do your follow-up and then.
Yeah, no, I think that answers my question. I just, it's curious to me because, the only variable seems to be, because you said the costs are fixed with the exception of the O&M and the fuel. So the variable to me would be the capacity factor. How much are we using these plants? How efficiently are we using these plants? Are they running all the time, or are we having to shut them down part of the time? That to me seems to be the big variable to me.
it is a big variable, absolutely.
Wouldn't you say, though, we're exporting so much of that power, we're running more efficient because we are exporting our surplus power?
It's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So in the last year, when natural gas was $8 and $9 and $10, every megawatt hour being produced by every coal plant in the state of Kansas was producing serious benefits for customers, right? But when natural gas falls to $2 and the wind is blowing a lot, now, we put a lot of pressure on these companies over the last 3 or 4 years to do what they can, when they can, to follow the market. Because if they can buy the power on the integrated marketplace at $20 a megawatt hour or 10 or free, then it only makes sense to shut down those coal plants for 3 or 4 days instead of burning coal and producing power at $21 a megawatt hour, So it's, when power prices are high, natural gas prices are high, and wind is low, we're running them all the time, as much as we can, as much as the environmental air requirements allow. But when power prices are low, wind is up, and natural gas is low, we're not running them like we did 10 years ago, right?
Sarfag?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. This kind of enters into this conversation with Senator Thompson. If usage is an issue, I'd read or heard somewhere that the state of Kansas was ranked 49th in energy efficiency. So if we're not very efficient, we're using more stuff, but then our numbers are that way. So I guess you might comment on that, or it'd be interesting if we're ranked 49th, what it takes to move us off of that kind of number.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the methodology is defined in terms of the ACEEE ranking for where the state ranks. What I have been told is that a lot of that is sort of outside of the individual utility or the KCC's control in terms of, I think it's building codes and other, standards, sort of market-wide or economy-wide standards in the state. I know also that energy efficiency advocates will tell you that we need more ratepayer funded energy efficiency, right? That we need to have larger programs and charge customers more for energy efficiency, and that will help, that will move the needle and move us up. Those are, I don't know, those are pretty in-depth, comprehensive type policy debates we have before the KCC, and I don't think there's any easy answers. But what I would say, if you look at slide 7, is this is monthly consumption per capita, right? And so if we had our chief economist down here and he was talking about the relative value of energy efficiency between Kansas and Missouri, it would be a much different conversation. He looks at all of the money that's been spent on energy efficiency in Missouri, for instance, and he looks at it and says, Missouri per customer, per capita still uses way more than we do in Kansas. Right? Now, we use 890 kilowatt hours and they use 1,039, and it's a big difference. But I think the rebuttal to that would be, yeah, but if we hadn't done all that energy efficiency, they'd use even more, you know? So it's, I don't know, unfortunately, there's just not a lot of easy answers to these questions and to these challenges. I probably haven't done your question justice, but I mean, the ACEEE methodology, we can look into it. You know, Missouri used to be very low rank like we are. You know, they will tell you, Evergy will get up and tell you, they have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on energy efficiency. They did raise in the rankings, but they're not like number one. You know, they've made, I think they're 37th or 30. So it's just one feature, one factor that contributes.
Maybe you can look into that. Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I can report that my average monthly consumption has gone up considerably. My bill has gone up because I bought an all-electric car. And so when I'm looking at these numbers, I'm saying the average monthly consumption used to be really your household, what you were doing for lighting, dishes, washing, heating and cooling. Now that we have these electric cars in there, how's that going to change understanding these numbers?
Well, it's a great question. You know, we have been, I mean, I think we're believers generally, maybe not to the individual, but generally we're believers in the concept of beneficial electrification. I mean, you gotta have, there's a question of, will we have the capacity to serve it all? You know, there's a lot of issues, right? Will we have the capacity to serve it? What about the transmission and distribution impacts? But the key to electrification transportation will be time of use and when customers are using it, right? Because we build this system and everybody builds every electric system to serve the peak, the hottest peak of the day on August 15th in the summer, and then you add 15% to that. And so if customers come home at 5 o'clock and plug in at 5 o'clock, then that is not going to be good. But if they wait and they time their cars and they do it from 9 o'clock till 3 a.m., that will be positive and will actually increase our consumption and will lower our rates relative to Senator Thompson's question of, you know, it's about load factor and system utilization and beneficial use of electricity. So a lot of challenges.
Yeah, that max hour, max day is going to be a big deal, and we might want to look at that in the future about trying to work with the utilities to put some kind of public service announcement when to charge your cars or when to do your charges to reduce that peak number, because as you increase the peak number, you got to have more capacity. My question is, when you look at page 11 on the industrial rates, the 6.5%, I'm assuming, are the special contracts, are they affecting the residential rates and the other commercial rates? That's my real question, because them industrial users that are getting them special contracts, there's a piece of the pie. Now they're paying a smaller piece of that pie. Are they affecting rates to go up on the residentials and others?
So, again, not an easy answer, but I'll do my best. It's certainly, to the extent that there are large industrial customers receiving special contracts, and there are, of course, right? But, so, any relatively new special contract, like in the last 2 or 3 years, hasn't started to affect residential or commercial rates yet because we haven't had a base rate case, but it's coming, right? That'll be part of the case that we have in April. But for other industrial customers, to the extent that those customers receive a break, then the company doesn't eat that, all right? You're right, it's the size of the pie stays the same, and they're gonna pay a little less, so others pay more. The standards that we have at the commission to look at a special contract is all about, it's typically in response to a competitive threat, and the question is, well, if this customer doesn't get this special contract, will they go away completely? And if they go away completely, how much more will rates go up, right? And so that's the balance. That's the commission's historical special rate policy and review process. That may end up changing some with the new economic development legislation that we passed a couple years ago, right? Now, there are tariffs that say you can get X percentage discount if you're a new customer moving to the state, and there isn't any of that explicit analytical framework of, well, is this customer a flight threat, or are they going to potentially is a competitive threat? The idea there being, well, a portion of something is more than nothing of nothing. And so I think the idea is, yeah, you're going to give these customers a break for 5 years, but then they're going to go back to the full tariff rate and help everybody. And of course, there's economic development benefits are broader than just rates too, right? There's follow-on customers that will pay full costs and everything else. But so to answer your question, yes, and special contracts are certainly affecting commercial and residential rates and have over many years. Some of these special contracts have existed for longer than before this table was started, right? So.
Okay, I think, let's go ahead and let you move on, and then we can finish up.
Okay, second half of this is going to be a little faster now, but that's okay. All right, so let's go to slide 16. The thing about the KCC rate making process is it very much is a legal process, right? The rate setting is governed and oriented by statutes and rules and regulations and Court of Appeals and Supreme Court appeal orders. We rely on a lot of different disciplines to do this job, from accounting and auditing, engineering, financial analysis, economics, but it's all fundamentally a legal process. So at the highest level, the KCC's job is to, in a rate case, we strive to produce substantial competent evidence that's necessary to decide a just and reasonable rate, that is necessary to provide efficient and sufficient service. And that all sounds like, just buzzwords, but it's not. They're terms of art, terms of law that have been defined and interpreted by courts, and they mean a lot to the actual practitioners that are doing this. But in order to accomplish all that, it's a bunch of legal terms, right? We issue formal discovery, and we write testimony, and we stand for cross-examination at hearings. Staff alone, so this upcoming Evergy rate case, will issue between 300 to 500 data requests, usually probably 500. And each of the interveners, we'll talk about the interveners as well, but each of the interveners will also issue their own sets of discovery, and they write testimony, and they cross-examine us, and we cross-examine them. But it's a legal process. The commission has 240 days to issue an order in Kansas. That's a little less than the average. I think you can find evidence out there that, literature that says the average period of time to set rates in this states or in this country is about 270 days. We do it in 240. And then there is a link there that's a much more comprehensive, like 20-page document that should work. If it doesn't, let me know. And that's a comprehensive overview that we put together for our rate study back in 2018. And I think my boss is going to talk tomorrow more about that specifics as well. There's a procedural schedule on slide 17, and it's from a relatively recent rate case in Black Hills. One quick thing I want to point out about this is that, you hear sometimes the concept of a rate case settling. And I think there's a negative or maybe an inaccurate connotation about what that means. If a rate case settles, the only thing that is not accomplished in this list of everything that we do is the initial brief and the staff brief, and maybe a couple of days of the evidentiary hearing. So in other words, in Kansas, when we settle a case, we still do all of the discovery phases, and we write testimony, and we have there's everybody has their day in court, and evidence is submitted and accumulated, and then after all that is filed with the commission, before we go to a hearing, all of those parties, many of them large, sophisticated, well-funded entities, sit down in a room, who've done this for 10 or 20 years, sit down in a room, and we basically litigate the case amongst ourselves and try to determine what the right answer is. And then if we settle a case, then that is submitted to the commission as a piece of evidence. It's just an option. The commission still has to independently review that, and they either reject it, modify it, or approve it. So it's not, this idea, it's not like done in a backroom smoky deal. It's just an option for the commission to consider. And importantly, it's got to be based on the record as a whole. Slide 18 is the role of interveners in the rate-making process. So, KCC staff, our role is to balance the interest between investors and customers and the utility itself. And there was some discussion, I think, earlier in this committee and others, that's an inappropriate role for the commission to hold or to take. The reason that we balance the interest between investors and shareholders is because the Supreme Court of Kansas has determined more than once that that's the appropriate role for the KCC. So our commission staff supports the decision-making and the process of the KCC, and so that's why we balance the interest and represent the public generally. It's also because customers, everybody would like free or very, very low price electricity, myself included. I'm an Evergy customer, but affordability matters. But so does reliability, so does safety of service, and when we have dealt with utility companies that are in financial distress, and that's not a good situation, right? Maintenance gets deferred. And reliability and safety can really be compromised. And so it's a balancing act, right? That's the point, is that it's a balancing act. That's what the courts have told us it has to be, and that's what we strive for. Most rate cases settle. Many, I would say, certainly not all. But if they do, then each of the interveners that is listed here, if you look, there was 21 interveners in the last Evergy rate case. These people all hired lawyers and accountants and attorneys, or lawyers, accountants, financial analysts. They all presented their own evidence. They issued discovery, and ultimately, many, if not all of them, filed testimony asking the commission to approve the agreement that they set. So this is not a concept of where it's being set by somebody else and they disagree. For the largest utility in the state, Evergy Kansas Central, every rate case since 2012 has been unanimously agreed to, and lists like that, like you see in that third bullet point of all of those major customers in the state, they were all in the room and settled on those for those rates as well. Slide 19. This gives you an example of, I mentioned there's 21 parties, so everybody will issue discovery and be involved, but not every party has the wherewithal or the expertise or the resources to do a revenue requirement analysis. Almost every party will do a class cost of service or rate design discussion, but not everybody does a revenue requirement analysis. So, but on slide 19, give you an example of how this last rate case went. Evergy asked for $52 million increase. Staff recommended a net reduction of $69 million. CURB recommended a net reduction of $139 million. KIC came in a little higher than staff and CURB, and they recommended a net reduction of $54 million. And then the United States Department of Defense was there as well. And, the evidence in that docket and Kerb would tell you this, the Kerb and staff's positions were very, very close. They didn't have a depreciation expert, so they didn't have any increase in depreciation expense accounted for in their number. And they recommended that the wind farm, Western Plains Wind Farm, be recovered purely through an ECA mechanism. We had a similar position, but we put a levelized amount in base rates and then just had a smaller adjustment off of that. So ultimately, staff and Kerb came in very, very close in that case, and we ended up settling that case at $66 million reduction after you account for property tax rebasing. So I don't, it's up to you. I can continue, or we can just stop for questions now.
Why don't you run through what you got left in a couple minutes, and then
Okay.
we'll do 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, sure, we'll do. So let's look at, just real quick, slide 20. These are some of the types of cases that you can see and that you'll hear about. Rate cases, general rate cases, what we'll see with Evergy this spring. That's governed by 66-117. Fuel clauses, you also hear those referred to as ECAs and PGAs. The reason that we allow those is because every regulated utility in the country has one of those. Fuel expenses, fuel and purchase power are, mostly driven purely by the deregulated wholesale market. And customers or utilities have very little control over those costs, and those costs can be so significant to drive a rate case. And so that's why every utility in the country has a fuel clause, an ECA or a PGA. Some of those other surcharges there, you can see those are all, with the exception of one, authorized by specific statute, and we can talk about the reasons for them or how we review them if we need to. But probably the last slide I'll touch on here is slide 21. Surcharges and riders can definitely be uncomfortable with customers, or customers can be uncomfortable with them. Whether it's in a public hearing or when we talk to customers, it's a common sentiment for a customer to say, why are all these line items on the bill? Does anybody really look at these? The answer to that is every surcharge or rider that's on the utility's bill is reviewed by the utility or reviewed by utilities division and staff, and a order is issued by the commission. With the exception of the transmission delivery charge, which we are attempting to change this session. But surcharges and riders can serve a valuable purpose in that regulatory lag is an important cost containment mechanism that regulators use to try to keep costs down and keep rates affordable for customers. And if there is a cost that is outside of the utility's control, or it's so significant as to drive a rate case, then it might make sense, and sometimes we do, it might make sense to track that cost separately from everything else so that the utility can stay out and leave all the rest of its costs subjected to regulatory lag over a longer period of time, 3, 4, 5 years. And so you work to get the utility to manage its overall cost structure in that fashion. So I think that's probably enough. If there's any specific questions,
Got a
definitely
couple questions.
love to answer them.
Sarah Fag, you got one?
I'm going to save my complicated ones for tomorrow.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, not saying anything. Thanks, Justin. I think this is a very good presentation. We look forward to the second part, and we can always give them to Peter if we got a couple questions. So
Thank you.
with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.